invite you to help yourself to coffee and cookies, which were provided courtesy of Arcega's Espresso Cafe and Marvin's IGA Grocers. And I also just want to point out, I have these questionnaires on the Brown Bag Lunch discussion series, and I will pass them out to the people in the back that didn't get one. If you haven't filled one out already, I'd appreciate your input on programs you'd like to see or times that are convenient for you. Today, Carl Totemeier will be speaking on shade-loving perennials. Mr. Totemeier has years of experience as a professional gardener. He was the director of the Old Westbury Gardens, a private garden in Long Island, for 11 years. He wrote a weekly gardening column for the New York Times for 14 years, and he worked at the New York Botanical Gardens for 5 years before retiring and moving to Fayetteville 9 years ago, was it? And he currently farms 25 acres, sells fruits and perennial plants at the Fayetteville Farmers Market, which should be starting up next week. Is that right? And today he's going to speak on shade-loving perennials. I'm very happy to introduce Carl Totemeier.
Thank you, Kendall. It is a small, small world. You can't really get away from people you know, or people who know people you knew. The lady over here, who has been in Fayetteville for, I guess, a good many years, and her husband taught at the university, etc. And one time, a couple of years ago at the farmer's market, somehow our conversation got around to the fact that she had a nephew on Long Island at that time who was involved with botanical gardens. And she told me just a little bit, and I said, "Oh, David Barnett." And I had known him well. He worked at an institution where I had worked, and he was a member of some groups that I belonged to. And the last time I saw him, as I was telling her, was a little over a year ago in Boston, where he now is the horticulturist at can't think of the name of it.
Cemetery. Cemetery in the United States.
Yeah. Something or another Hill Cemetery. I had the name. I'm getting old. Can't remember it. I had it when I was talking to her. But in any case, it's yeah, okay. I'll accept that. It's one of the oldest cemeteries, if not the oldest cemetery, which was really created, you see, as a garden in the country. And buried in there are all sorts of people, from the Cabots and the Lowells to various distinguished scientists. Asa Gray, the botanist, the noted botanist, is buried there, etc. And David is involved with that at this particular point. And we enjoyed the tour. So it's not uncommon, no matter where you go, to find people that you knew elsewhere. We, at one day, actually, at that farmer's market, there were 2 families came through. And the New York Botanical Garden is in the Bronx. 2 families came through that lived within eyesight, or had lived within eyesight, of the New York Botanical Garden. One of them was a professor here at the university, the other was a tourist. On the same day, 2 people from the Bronx. Yet, the Bronx is the way you pronounce that. So anyway, perennials for shade. In my estimation, the only way to garden when you get this far south is in the shade. It gets hot in the summer out there in that sun. And not only that, but plants do best when they get a little shade, including those that, and many of those at least, that the book says are adapted to sunlight. You give them a little shade and they're happier when you get down in this part of the world, particularly with those, that sun beating down, and along about the middle of July it begins to get dry, etc. It's just much easier to garden in the shade. The common complaint that people have about shade gardening, however, or gardening in the shade, if you will, is that there's nothing out there of interest to put in that shade. Okay, you can put petunias and marigolds and all these things out in the sun, but what are you going to put in the shade? Well, I brought just a sample of the things that are coming into bloom, or far enough along that you can see what they will do, that have been just covered with plastic. Not really heated, but covered with plastic to bring them on a little sooner because of the farmer's market opening in about a week. So you can see the variety that you have here. And we might just touch on some of these initially. One of the things that I think that people should be aware of is the differences between various hostas. And hosta is one of the, well, it's actually the second most popular perennial in the country at this point, and really is the leading one for shade. When you buy a small hosta, unless you have something like the book that we have here that has a section in the back listing most of the hostas that are really, have good distribution today, with all the description of how big they're going to get, etc., you really don't know when you buy that little one what you're going to get. Most of the ones that you will buy, particularly from discount stores, at this point have been propagated by tissue culture. And they just push them long enough to get them big enough to sell. It will take a hosta that has big leaves, the kind that everyone seems to want at this point, a minimum of 3 years, and in some cases up to 5, to get up to where they will have the leaves that they are desirable for, or to where that plant will have enough shoots to really make a showing. If it is one of the smaller types that has small leaves and is maybe 2 feet in diameter versus 3.5 to 4 feet in diameter, it may only take 2 to 3 seasons for them to shape up, have the full size of leaves that they are expected to have. And the other aspect is color. They don't get their full coloration or their maximum color until they reach that mature stage. So here are 2, same age. These are from tissue culture. This will be the 3rd season for them. And this one is going to have big leaves. They will be probably 4 to 5 times the size of this one at maturity. Okay, there are 2 stems in that one at this point, which is typical. And I haven't counted them in here, but they're probably at least 6 or 7. So this one, in other words, will be pretty well shaped up this season as those leaves expand. This one, it's still going to be another 2 to 3 seasons before it will reach its mature stage. So that's something to keep in mind, and unless one of the significant factors related to this is that unless you are aware of this, you may not leave enough space in the garden for that big one. You just don't know how to anticipate what it's going to do unless you know what it's going to do. Which is one of the reasons why I try to sell, market stuff that's pretty good size, because you know what you're getting. There are many kinds of plants that make excellent ground covers in the shade and that will flower as well. This is, I think, one of the better ones. It's Tiarella, native in the Appalachians, Tiarella. And the most common ones, white flowers. When they really get established, each one of these looks like a little thing of cotton candy. And its name, really common name, is foam flower. And foam, yeah. Because it just, kind of looks like somebody had taken one of these cans of that artificial whipped cream or shaving cream or something, you see, as you look across them. The common one, as I say, has had just white flowers. Now you're beginning to see pink buds, pink flowers, etc. And this one is called ink blot because as it develops, and you can't see this yet, but the center of the leaf will have a dark, sort of a chocolatey color blob in the middle. So basically what I'm saying is they're coming up with forms of this that not only have different flower forms, but will have interest in the foliage, so that the foliage is more interesting when they're not in flower. Flowers very early, very hardy. As I say, it's from the Appalachian region, so it will do very well in this particular area. Tiarella. You're all familiar with the coral bells, I think. You should be. They will grow in shade as well, light shade. They're coming out with many of the heuchera or coral bells with foliage that is attractive. There are some with silvery foliage, quite a number with this purplish foliage. This is purple petticoats, one of the newer ones. They do flower. Their flowers, I don't think, in my estimation, are quite as attractive as the ones on the more traditional green-leaved coral bells. However, since this one, or the coral bells, and the tiarella are first cousins, now you can do this with plants. You can't do it with people. but you, well, you can, but you're not supposed to. Although I did, a group came by at the farmer's market one time a couple years ago, and the guy next to me sort of looked at me and he says, looks like they're a little too closely related to each other. But anyway, you can hybridize these and come up with now one that they call Heucherella that flowers more heavily than either one of them. It's partly because it is sterile. It's a sterile hybrid. Therefore, the strength of the plant doesn't go into producing seed, but it goes into the plant, which makes it flower more heavily. So anyway, all sorts of things. The old fashioned bleeding heart, also available in white flower, or the other type of bleeding heart, or dicentra, which is the generic name, which has the fern leaf foliage, available in a number of shades of the red and pink, or the white as you see here. The advantage of this one is that it will flower essentially all season long in light shade as long as you keep it moist. This one comes up early, flowers, and is then done for the season. If it's in pretty good shade, the foliage will last really until it begins to really get hot and dry, and then it dies back to the ground. You want to actually be sure you know where this one is located so you don't come in and plant something on top of it. But these will keep going all season long. Ferns. Wide variety of ferns. These are all things, again, that will do well in shade. And think in terms of the bold foliage of those hostas when they really get developed. And then having something that becomes a foil for that contrasts with it. The texture is fine and delicate rather than rather coarse and bold as with the hostas. And, of course, the thing that comes to mind are ferns. This is Japanese painted fern, just beginning to start. And they have interesting markings with the silver and then sort of the reddish bronze on them. Once you get them established, if you have a good organic mulch around them, the spores will drop into that mulch and you will get new ferns coming up. And if you look at the foliage pattern on each of those, you will find that each one is different, just like snowflakes. No two will have the same marking. If, on the other hand, they are a so-called clone and have been propagated by division, then each one will be alike. But if you get them to come up from spores, you will have each one being slightly different. Cinnamon fern. This one I brought primarily, this one gets rather big, and I've seen them 4 feet tall, while this one, maybe 16, 18 inches in height. So you actually can get a contrast even, you see, within the ferns. This one much coarser. But I brought this one because the croziers, the fiddle heads so-called, are coming up here that will unfold to become the fronds. And the fiddle heads of cinnamon fern are edible. Particularly back in New England, they use them as anyone else would use asparagus. You can put them green in salads, or you can cook them as you would, steam them as you would with asparagus. There is actually a cannery in Vermont that cans them. So you can grow your own shade asparagus by having cinnamon fern. One of the questions that you commonly get when you're working around a botanical garden or cooperative extension, etc., is that someone will every season call you and say, my ferns have all of these insects on the bottom of the leaves and they're all lined up in rows. What do I do about it? Well, those are spores. They're looking forward to the next generation. And obviously you don't do anything about it. The reason for mentioning this, however, is that there are some ferns that don't have the spores on the back of the fronds or leaves, but they have separate fertile fronds that come up in the middle. Now, they will be a sort of a brownish color, and most people will say that they detract from the appearance of the fern. They're kind of rigid and not particularly attractive. You're not going to really hurt that fern's ego too much if you just snip them out. But cinnamon fern is one that has the fertile fronds. There are quite a number of little anemones that do well in the shade. We have some native ones, certainly, that probably going out into the woods almost anywhere where you don't have livestock to trample them and so forth, you will find these. And they tend to be among the early things that flower, of course, in the spring. This one is actually an oriental one. It's Anemone sylvestris. It spreads. It's trying to grow out of the bottom of the pot. It's not, it isn't the sort of thing that you run and get the hoe or the herbicide as soon as you see it done, because you want it to spread out there in that shade and make a showing. There are also anemones sort of loosely grouped together under the heading of Japanese anemones that get up to, as many, or some of them will get as tall as 3 feet. They flower depending on the species or the cultivar from about the middle of August on through October. And they come in white, in pink, in a so-called red, which to me is a little more orange, and I don't particularly like it as kind of a garish color. And then doubles in all of those. But they will be about the last thing to flower. We used to deadhead them, and I think if we get to the slides here in a minute, you'll see one of them. We used to deadhead them after they finished flowering at Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island. And then one year we didn't get it done. And we discovered that each of those flowers turned into a little puff of cotton, which in itself was very attractive. So we tried to repeat that error after that. This is Brunera. The leaves on this will get to be, once it's established in the ground, probably 4 to 5 inches long. So really it does much the same thing as a hosta as far as its foliage is concerned. It flowers early with these forget-me-not-like flowers. It has been in the past called Chinese forget-me-not. If you ever planted the biennial anchusa that gets quite tall, in fact, this used to be called anchusa, so that it was the perennial anchusa versus the biennial. But an early forget-me-not, if you will, that is very, very hardy. Brunera, B-R-U-N-N-E-R-A. Or if you want it in a variegated form. This is the one that's hard to keep in stock. It's hard to buy. And if you make the mistake of selling every one you have, the next year you may not have it, because you probably can't buy it even wholesale to pot up. Again, keep in mind that the leaves get quite large on this. They get to be a couple of feet across in a couple of years, and 16 inches or so high. And we'll have the same flowers that you see here, this little blue forget-me-not type flower. Brunera, B-R-U-N-N-E-R-A.
Is there a common name for that?
Chinese forget-me-not. What's the other common name for it? It slipped me.
Siberian bug gloss.
Yeah, okay. She's got it. That's it. Siberian bug gloss. I couldn't remember it. I tell you, I'm getting old. She's right. Okay, so May is coming one of these days, and you can go out and buy yourself a case of Blue Nun and invite the neighborhood in and have May wine, as long as you have gallium or sweet woodruff. This one flowers with a little white flower, usually about the 1st of May. It loves the shady woodland, and it will spread to make a nice carpet. Now, it's a really very lovely little ground cover. Gallium or sweet woodruff, W-O-O-D-R-U-F-F. And sprigs of that floating in the Blue Nun, or in other words, a Rhine wine, along with slices of orange and possibly pineapple, and you have May wine. No, May wine is complete without it. I don't have any of it to sell, however. I've just got 3 of them, and I got to keep them to propagate. So all these things are shade. Epimedium. Knew of a fellow on Long Island, or not Long Island, but in New York. He was a retired advertising executive, had his own firm in Long Island City. And a heart attack when he was in his 40s caused him to retire, and subsequently he made 35 trips to Japan, bringing back epimediums every time he went. And at his death about 2 years ago, he had 34, 35 different epimediums. And when the woman who had helped him with his garden for a number of years came in to see him the day before he died, his question when she came in was, "Are you still dividing the epimediums?" This one essentially is deciduous. It's almost like a little shrub. It grows about a foot tall. Again, it depends on the species or cultivar of it. And then before the foliage comes, you get little flowers that vary up to about 1 inch in diameter. Some are smaller, white, pink, yellow, a little deeper rose red color, etc. But it's one of the really highly valued ground cover type plants for shade. Foliage is interesting all through the season. Native of the Orient. One of the things that we are increasingly learning is that because most of our ancestry, lay in Europe, those are the plants we brought to this country. Now, particularly England. England is an island. We are a continental climate. When you get away from the Northeast, Maine, etc., Massachusetts, and the Northwest, Seattle, and so forth. So a lot of those things that came to us by way of England, or even France, and particularly the coastal portions of Europe, really weren't adapted to our inland climate. They just tend not to do well. On the other hand, if you look at an analogous situation as it would relate to other continents, you begin to think Siberia, China, Mongolia, etc. And indeed, those are the things that tend to do best for us. And increasingly now, people, particularly since we have better access to some of those places than we did a few years ago, many people are traveling there and collecting at the present time. You're beginning to see a lot of these things show up now in the nurseries, etc. as a result of that. Okay, we were talking, a couple of us ahead of time. Did you ever study the doctrine of signatures? Dr. De Palma. Now, I'm surprised.
Well, that's why I'm
medical doctor.
still here to learn.
Well, the old doctrine of signatures was that basically if a plant looked like something, you named it after that. And if a plant looked like it had spots on it and spotted, if you have lung disease, it probably got spots on it, so you called it pulmonaria or lungwort. And then the other part of that was basically that you probably said, well, if it looks like that, it's probably good to treat it. And that's the whole basis of a lot of the herbal medicines, etc. Some of them probably turned out to be all right, and others maybe psychologically worked, I'm not sure. But anyway, the pulmonarias are very attractive. They work in the shade. They spread, and they all have interesting leaf patterns such as this. All have flowers that it is related, by the way, to the Virginia bluebell. The flowers all remind you of that. They tend to open pink or sort of reddish color and then turn blue, except for the one strain of them or one type of them a variety of that is David Ward, but where the flower tends to stay red. So the patterns on the leaf vary from just almost pure silver to all kinds of combination of spots that you see here, or sizes of spots.
Does that only bloom in the spring?
It only flowers in the spring, yeah. But the foliage is good, you see, all season long. So what we're getting at is that there are many things, and we'll show you more of them on the slides here right away, that flower in their season. Most I will admit, flower in the spring primarily. There are some that flower in the middle of the summer. Hostas flower beginning in late May and on through until almost frost. But you tend to have a dearth of flowers in the summer in the shade. There just aren't as many flowers. But then think in terms of shades of foliage color, shades of green, yellow, variegated, etc. Think in terms of the form of the leaf, the texture of the leaf, the height, etc. Basically, horticulture is one of those few areas that really is both an art and a science. There's a science that enables you to perhaps grow them better. But when you look at a plant and say, this one would be good used in this manner, then it becomes art. And the same principles apply as they would to painting a picture as such. I hope that all of you will support the new botanical garden. I think we need it in the community. I am not one to put down ball fields, ball diamonds, etc. I think you need them, particularly for the kids. But there are other needs too. And if you look at that word, recreation, it's recreation. I have, and I'm going to give you this example. When I would teach courses on Long Island years ago, there was always this rather elderly lady sitting in the front row. And for quite some time I didn't get to meet her, but then finally one day we did get together, and she said, at that time I was the director of Bayard Cutting Arboretum on the south shore of Long Island. And she said, you know, my husband and I credit Bayard Cutting with saving our lives. I was a bit taken aback. She said, you know, we had a few years ago a business setback. She said, we lost our business. And she said, we lost our will to live. This was what we did, and this was us. And she said, we sort of struggled around, and one day we drove by this place, wondered what was inside, and we drove in. And we walked through the woods, and we found a bench down by the river. This was the Connecticut River, which lay between the Bayard Cutting estate and W.K. Vanderbilt's estate. Normally, the Connecticut River would have been about the size of the West Fork of the White River as it comes into Fayetteville. But those two gentlemen had dredged it out so they could bring their yachts up and tie them, at their own estate. So it was a quarter mile across. And they would come and sit on that bench with flowering cherries and that sort of thing overhead, and the petals dropping in the spring. Swans swimming in that yacht basin that was created on the river. And they said, you know, suddenly life became worth living again. And we started over, and we succeeded. You need that aspect of a botanical garden to go along with the other aspects of parks, etc., because people need that kind of recreation too. Okay, the last one here, this used to be called lamium. It's now lamiastrum, L-A-M-I-A-S-T-R-U-M. Good in light shade, flowers early in spring, and if you can keep it moist, it will scatter some flowers really all through the season. You got them with white flowers, you got them with pink flowers, you got them with mauve flowers, you've got them with various patterns of the variegation on the leaf. It spreads, not voraciously, this one, its cousin lamium does. You plant one lamium and then you stand back or retreat quickly, hoping you get out of the way. This one is a little bit more refined. It's a lot more refined, I should put it that way. But anyway, this hopefully gives you a good idea of what is available. And I didn't bring any of the common ground covers because I think you all know them. Many of you probably have grown this as a houseplant, commonly called a strawberry begonia. It's not a strawberry and it's not a begonia. It's a saxifrage, but it propagates itself like a strawberry by producing runners. It has little flower spikes come up that are sort of a pinkish white a little bit later in the spring. This one is hardy enough that when 40 years ago, when I dismantled an old greenhouse range in Iowa City, Iowa, the glass had been out of this greenhouse, this particular one, for probably 10 years. And this one was thriving under the bench in the shade, but other than that, exposed to nature as such, and you know, it can get 20 below zero there. I planted some in a woodland area that I have, and it's beginning to spread and do well. So that there are many ground covers other than the traditional hardy myrtle, this sort of thing you see. And there's nothing, we're not saying that there's anything wrong with those, but in other words, there are other choices that you can make. So this one is good for that. Any questions at this point? You have a sheet that I have had, yes?
Gallium, what percentage alcohol do you get out of that?
He would ask that. The alcohol has to come from the wine. This is probably has something to do with witchcraft, I suspect. But anyway, this is the garnish that goes in there.
We have a lot of deer that come up on our property.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of these that you mentioned particularly something they love?
Hostas are dessert for deer.
Are there any that they would not want to eat?
There are some. It's difficult to come across a good list of this. Someone the other day in this area, and I can't recall who I was talking to now, was interested in putting this together. When I wrote a regular column from the New York Times, I received on a regular basis a horticultural publication from actually Northern California. And in that, they had listed plants that were resistant to deer out there. And quite a number of them would grow on Long Island in the Northeast. So I took those out and printed them in a column in the New York Times and said, you know, I would like feedback on this because here are some that have proven resistant to deers in the Pacific Northwest, and if any of you have others to add to the list, maybe we can compile something. Because people were actually abandoning their properties because they couldn't grow anything back there. And actually, of course, back in that part of the country, there's when you get into any sort of a densely populated area, there's no hunting. And I got hate mail. If somebody were to, introduce Bambi into the theaters, I think it would be picketed, and they might even shoot the projectionist back there because it's really a problem. Because everything on that list from California, they would eat at one time or another. There are some things that they won't eat daffodils, for example. Daffodils have a certain toxicity. In fact, daffodils create a very severe dermatitis on many people. One guy didn't find out till after he'd gone to the bathroom in a place I worked years ago. But in any case, daffodils are resistant. Yews, by and large, tend to be resistant. And I'm sure there are others of these, but at this point I don't feel that I know enough about it to give you a listing that is going to be certain, because everything that this guy over here says, they don't bother it on my place, this guy over here says they eat it. So it may depend on how hard up they are for something to eat. I suspect that they have their preferences and they eat those first, and then if they aren't hungry anymore, why, they probably stop. But it's a real difficult problem because the deer population is getting so intense around some of these areas. The sheet that you had passed, yes?
I have another problem that isn't restricted to shade perennials, but it's moles. What do you advise for moles?
I've got a cat that works real good there.
Yeah, but
I could rent her out. Moles basically are tunneling through the soil, to get insects. If you are not strictly an organic gardener, and do not have an aversion to using something such as diazinon, spectricide, etc., as an insecticide on the lawn, on the beds. That will control particularly grubs and this sort of thing. And then the moles will not tunnel into that area after the first expedition, and they find there's nothing there. I don't know of an organic control for moles, but that will be effective. There are, I mean, you can trap them. If you get a trap, you can put these clacker things that are kind of like a little one of these windmill sort of toys that come around, and every time they come around they clack. Some people say they work, others say they don't work. Yes?
Something else you can do is when you're gardening, you can throw the little grubs out.
Yeah, you can do it.
Instead of leaving them in the garden, every time you find one, you throw it out.
And probably there you will get cooperation from robins and mockingbirds.
I'm willing to use the chemical. How do you use it?
The best way on that is use it according to directions on the bag.
It will say how.
Yeah, it will tell you. Diazinon, spectricide. There are others, I suspect, too. I haven't really kept up with that. Spearmint chewing gum in the run.
I've tried that, and castor oil, and
Yeah.
all kinds of things.
In theory, the spearmint gum, you don't dare handle it with your bare hands. Or your odor is on it, and it doesn't work. I'm not too sure whether it works anyway. Castor beans, some people swear by castor beans. Some of these things are a little like marigolds and nematodes. And some people will interplant, you know, cabbage and marigold, cabbage and marigold. Research at the University of Connecticut found that not to be effective at all. However, if you take a bed where you're going to plant cabbage next year and plant it entirely to marigolds this year, then till them in, then next year you won't have them. So anyway, yes, sir.
Well, the problem with armadillos.
Armadillos? You know, it took me quite a while to realize that there was such a thing as a non-roadkill armadillo. Because I'd only seen them alongside the roads with their feet up in the air. I suspect probably the best control is some kid with a .22 rifle and a flashlight. Does anybody know of anything else that will really deter armadillos? Maybe a fox terrier dog.
Railroad ties.
They might be quite effective, particularly if you bury it a little bit so they can't work under. And really, an armadillo, as I understand it, if he comes up against something like a rock wall or a railroad tie, he bumps his nose into it and he makes a left or right turn. So that might be effective. In other words, the raised bed approach. I think that would probably work, because I'm sure he's not going to climb up into it. Anything else? Excuse me.
Is it too late in the year to divide moving parts?
Are they up?
Yes.
How far?
About like your red one.
I would wait and do it either this fall, if you are sure, in other words, where it is, so that you know what you don't dig it apart. Yeah, okay. The other alternative is to wait in the spring until you just barely see them coming up, so you know what you're doing. Maybe the best thing to do really is to run through some of the things on that sheet of paper, and then we'll show slides, and if we don't have time to show all the slides, well, you can get up and leave when you want to. And see, I did have one of those. And I'm sensing that maybe some of you will have questions on some of these things, and that may be more important almost than seeing pictures.
You mentioned some that have some height to them. Would you look for perennial shrubs or something?
This one doesn't have the shrub list on it. I've got another one with shrubs. Let's see if we can't do much of that with the slides when we get to them here in a minute. Okay. Observations on perennials, you really can follow this through pretty much. I don't know, I think maybe the best way would be if you have questions on any of these items, we would attempt to answer them. When we talk about shade, I think Gerald Klingeman from the university has a good definition of shade. Full sun is where Bermuda grass grows. and you can't do anything about it. Light shade or partial shade is where things such as the fescues will grow and do quite well. Total shade or dense shade is where none of these grasses will grow and do well. So you can evaluate what you have pretty much by what grasses will do in that particular situation. Most of the shade-loving plants work best in what I would call light shade. In other words, not really dense shade. And they do well where you have either morning sun for a few hours and shade the rest of the day, or dappled sunlight, where the canopy is light enough that, you know, here and there sunlight will get through, and then as the sun goes across the sky, these shadows and these light patches move so that the plant will get its proper combination of some sun and shade the rest of the time. So that seems to be where they do best. Most of the shade plants really like a very highly organic soil. In nature, if we didn't disturb it, the leaves of the oak trees and so forth would fall to the ground and they'd decompose, and they would, that would be their function in essence. Where in essence we're going in and you know, basically everybody rakes their leaves up instead of leaving them in place. You really need to think in terms of replacing or replenishing or keeping that organic mulch up in some manner. What that does is, primarily in a shady situation, is to retain that moisture. And then earthworms work it into the soil, loosen the soil so the roots penetrate better. Very often in shade you can't really till that soil up or prepare that soil as you would out in the open because you have to compete with roots. The old philosophy for growing perennials, the old English philosophy, was that you double dug every bed. In other words, you went on the bed and you threw down 1 spade depth, you threw that soil off to the side. And then you started at the end of the bed and you put in organic matter, you put such as peat moss or compost, you put in fertilizer, you put in lime if you needed it, and you turned that next layer over, leaving it in place. Then you threw the top layer back in and at the same time mixed it with more organic matter, fertilizer, lime, etc. And in essence you had soil prepared to almost 2 feet deep. One of the places I worked on Long Island, which was a former estate, they used to triple dig, and the guy had a Jersey dairy. That was his hobby, was Jersey cows, and they took that byproduct and worked that in 3 feet deep. The only place on Long Island rather, that you had soil that was deeper than that. Every other place had soil like that and it was sand clear down to the bedrock. One of the problems is in a shade situation is planting under trees and competing with the roots. When you're in that situation, keep in mind you can't raise the level of that soil very much. If you do raise it, you want to make certain that it is a loose, fluffy, particularly organic mixture. It could be just plain compost as such. And if you have trees where the roots really give you a problem, think more in terms of sticking with the ground covers such as the hardy myrtle, which you can work in between where you don't happen to hit a root, and they will spread along the surface, you see, and give you a carpet cover. In other words, don't really attempt to chop those roots out. You really can't compete with them. It's not going to do the tree any good, etc. But try to plant among the roots rather than the other. Yes?
Are you spreading chrysanthemum perennial? Will it last?
Chrysanthemum?
There's a spreading chrysanthemums you can use as a ground cover.
Except that they would want essentially full sunlight because it's a sun plant. Yeah. Yes?
How about oak trees? Can you still put soil on top of around oak trees? Don't their roots go down further?
The roots go down further, but the problem with putting soil over roots basically is that roots need oxygen. And if you pile soil too heavily over the top of the roots, in essence, you're shutting out the oxygen. You can plant more readily under an oak tree than you can under a maple because the roots happen to be deeper to begin with. Therefore, you don't disturb the roots or they don't interfere with your planting as much as a maple, or you don't find many beech in this area, but beech are another one of those trees with very shallow roots. Yeah, sweet gum is another one. So you get a difference. Given a choice, the most desirable tree to plant under is probably an oak because of the root system. It's just easier to do. What other things are important on here? See anything you have any question about before we try to show you a few slides right quick? I think most everything is there. Trees compete with perennials for water and nutrients. Take this into account and apply not only for the tree, but for the plants themselves. Weeds are less of a problem. Organic mulch will reduce water loss, etc. Many native wildflowers do well in the shade. This may be one reason to go native. As such, many early flowering spring bulbs will do the same thing. They mature before the shade comes. Therefore, they have completed their seasonal cycle. Shade gardening is less work than gardening in the sun. That, to me, says it all right there.
Don't have to worry about sunscreen.
So anyway, the list that you see here are plants that will work well in the shade. I do have a separate list, which I was thinking was on here too, of shrubs that work well in the shade. The lady back there asked me about that, asked me sometime at farmer's market or something, and I will make sure that I bring that so that you'll have that as well. It opens the first Saturday in April. And if you ask me at least twice, I will be sure that by the second time I've got it there. Any other questions before I run through some slides?
Pine trees, can you tell us about under pine trees?
Pine trees, it depends a little bit on the pine. White pine, if you have like a grove of them, in essence, they can produce such dense shade that, in fact, it has been referred to by plant people as a living desert. In other words, the tree's living up there, but it's like a desert beneath. You really can't grow much under them. Now that said, some of the other pines are less dense, therefore, as far as the shade is concerned, so you can grow under them. The needles are very acid, therefore pines lend themselves to planting rhododendrons, azaleas, the other ericaceous things, and most of the ground covers and other sorts of shade-loving plants will work pretty well from that standpoint, as long as, in essence, that shade isn't too dense. What do you do if you have a backyard that's wooded and the shade is just too dense to grow these things? It fits that latter category that I said. No grass is going to grow there, period. And it's too dense a shade then for the shade-loving perennials to grow there. What do?
You can limb them up or you can just enjoy it. Yeah.
You can limb them up. Yeah, you can enjoy it. The other thing basically is that sometimes if this is a natural woodland, you will find that you've got some of those trees in there that are pretty good trees. They're sound. They're going to be there. And then you've got some kind of skinny little ones that really are never going to amount to too much because the others are overshadowing them. Okay, take some of those out. Thin a little. You'll still have your shade, but it will be less dense, and you will find that many of these things can grow in there, especially natives. Especially natives.
What about mosses?
About which?
Moss. M-O-S-S.
I got to get into these slides, and you'll see. Somewhere there's a button, and I'll run around to the other side. Stand by my machine. Before we moved down here, we planted apple trees. We planted apple trees because we knew some would survive and there'd be something to do when I got here. After a couple of seasons of late freezes and one of fire blight, I began to move on to other things. And I mixed the juice of the berries with the apples, and some of you may remember it. People really loved that blended juice down at the market. Okay, but for various reasons I began to move on to things that probably I had a little more involvement with. Just to show you the perennial gardens that I had back east, this is Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island, where I was the director for 11 years. And this was our perennial garden. A 2-acre garden within a brick wall, the typical cloister arrangement of squares with a fountain in the center, etc. The paths lined with perennials such as this. This is significant to you because it represents one approach to continuous color all season, or continuous interest in a perennial garden. How's it done? This garden starts in the spring, in early May, with groupings along these beds with tulips in those groupings. So they provide the first color. Often they're underplanted with English daisies or pansies, which adds to the early color, and then when the tulips are dying down, well, you've got those. The rest of the bed is planted primarily with perennials, and they're doing their thing, coming up, getting ready to go. But the early color comes from the bulbs. The bulbs come out when they're finished. Annuals go into those places. Okay, well, the annuals are growing. The perennials are doing their thing. But the middle of the summer, when there are less perennials making a show, the annuals are at their peak. So you've got color all summer long. Okay, fall comes along. You still have some fall perennials that come in, but the annuals are beginning to fade and get a little ratty. They come out, and chrysanthemums go in that have been growing in pots in a nursery. So with that sequence of spring bulbs, summer annuals, and fall chrysanthemums imposed upon or superimposed upon this perennial border, in essence you get continuous interest. This is the heavy-duty backwork approach, because you're always putting something in and taking it out. This is the New York Botanic Garden. This is the Enid A. Haupt Conservatory, an acre under glass. The tall center of that conservatory is 90 feet high. It's the Palm House. There is a lift in that, and around the circle up there, there's a catwalk, and we had a reporter get stranded up there one time. Had to call the fire department to get him down because the lift stuck. But anyway, this has just been, by the way, completely renovated as of a couple of years ago. And here's our perennial garden there, or one scene from it. And here a different approach is taken. The continuous interest comes from including in among the flowering perennials things with interesting foliage, such as the silvery artemisia you see there. And you really can't see it from this picture, but there are some of the purple barberries, or the golden leaf barberries, and other shrubs and so forth you see that have interesting foliage. There you don't have to take things in and out in the middle of the season, because if there is a time when the perennials aren't at their peak, in essence, you have interesting foliage from the standpoint of texture, color, etc. This is the low-maintenance approach to continuous interest in the garden. As I mentioned earlier, just cover my perennials about the middle of February with plastic. I really don't heat, except there may be a critical stage when they're tender as they first start growing, where I might put a heater in for the night to keep them from freezing. Shade. This is what we're talking about. This is Grant Park in Chicago. How many of you have visited Chicago in the summer and been in Grant Park at lunch hour? What do you see under these trees? All these people working in these high-rise buildings on Michigan Boulevard coming over to eat their lunch because it's pleasant, it's comfortable in that shade, it's cool, regardless of what the temperature might be. Eureka Springs Garden, regrettably they went with annuals in much of the shade, and that's high maintenance, high cost. Every year they have to be replanted. I was involved in some of the early planting, and then I stepped aside. And in this area, my concept was that you plant lots of flowering dogwoods, you use azaleas, you use ground covers, you use perennials that are going to come back every year, particularly except where you want a little special color, like at the entrance and around the fountain was up there. And there you plant annuals and tubs and this sort of thing. But in other areas, make it look very naturalistic, because, you know, that property, if I would have had that property back east when I was back there, I would have found people who would have killed for that property, just because the property itself is so interesting. So anyway, misfortune. Contrast this with Lakevold Gardens in Tacoma, Washington, daughter of one of the, or heiress, let's say, to the Weyerhaeuser fortune. This is open to the public now. Here's just a little shady side path going off of the main garden where you have ferns, you have ground cover, you have some primroses in the background to draw attention. You have a purple leaf, cut-leafed Japanese maple off to the left. So basically, even if things aren't in flower, the foliage is interesting in there, and it's cool. This, by the way, is now the home of the National Hardy Fern Collection, because they can grow ferns there that you can't in the Northeast, you see, and yet they can grow the same ones. So that it is open to the public. You may have to call, but it's Lakevold, Lakevold. This was my backyard at the New York Botanical Garden. I apologize because it didn't sweep the sidewalk before I took this. But you've got azaleas, you've got actually a juga, the little purple spikes coming up there. And the one little clump in the center, which is really the blue native phlox that we have along the roadsides here, and it's one of those blues that doesn't really photograph blue. If you could see this a little more carefully, on top of the yews in the background, there's a clambering wisteria trying to take over. And actually in the corner off to the left, there's one of the hardy oranges, and they have thorns that long. And this, keep in mind, was the Bronx, and it was there for a purpose. We did have about a 6-inch rock go through our upstairs bedroom window once. And moss. That's a moss lawn in North Carolina. It's all moss. Okay, what do you need for moss? Well, you need a heavy soil, preferably, one that's been tramped down real good so that it really isn't too well aerated and stays moist, and the moisture. And if you killed out everything else and established moss, you could have a moss lawn, and you really only even have to mow it. And the Japanese do this a lot. But that's basically what this is. There's a serpent of some sort that the guy made with his welding torch. He had other pieces of sculpture around the place. I didn't really take pictures of those. Some of them were really not fit to show in mixed company. But anyway, that was his moss lawn. Now, if you go to, so it can be done. You'll aid and abet its establishment by, you know, Sir Thomas Lipton didn't invent the tea bag. Some European gardener did, and it was a burlap bag filled with cow manure, and he dunked it up and down the rain barrel, and he used the tea from that to water with. So this is good stuff. Okay, you put a little of that on that lawn, along with possibly some buttermilk, and you'll have a cover of moss real quick-like. And in fact, that works on stone walls. Except you don't even have to make the tea. You just get it a little thick and paint it onto the paintbrush. And keep it moist, and you'll get moss quickly. Visit New York City. Go to Purchase, north of New York City. PepsiCo World Headquarters. Shah of Iran came to this country when they chased him out. Before he got chased to this country, before he died then with cancer, he had made an agreement or contract with, in fact, I think Henry Moore was one of the sculptors, but a number of them, to create these massive pieces of sculpture for an outdoor garden in Iran. He wasn't able to pay for this, so Donald Kendall, the chairman of the board of PepsiCo, did. And around their New World headquarters in Purchase, there's a 200-acre garden created as a setting for those pieces of modern sculpture. Okay, so as you look out from the building, you look across the lawns and you see these things, but the eye stops with a wooded area. And that wooded area is planted all the way around this 200 acres, all the way around with a pathway through it, with shade-loving plants, hostas, ferns, etc. They're just getting started in this one in the spring. Places where there are a little more light, they added other things, even including the Artemisia you see there, and Sedum autumn joy, and the one with the pink flowers is the Spirea japonica, etc. Now, beyond that is the parking lot. In other words, you look across the lawn, here are the pieces of sculpture, then there's a woodland with a beautiful garden in it, and all the cars are on the other side of that woods. You don't have to look at them. It's a real delightful place to visit, and shows what in other words, an industrial garden could look like if you got somebody that puts his mind to it. You know, even tell me that Donald Kendall has a summer home down here in Arkansas someplace. I haven't figured out where yet, but anyway. This is show you quickly a few of the spring bulbs that you can plant that will come up and they will have completed their cycle, completed their cycle before the leaves come on, so they don't care if it's shady later on. This is Eranthus, winter aconite. Grows about 4 inches tall. I've seen it melt its way in February through the snowdrift. It actually gives off heat as it grows. So it will melt its way through snow. Comes that early. Whoops, I'm going to press the right buttons here. Dark picture, too dark for here, but this represents things like grape hyacinths, Cyandodoxa, blue squill. There are many of these things that will naturalize, will spread. This is snowdrops. Even some of the early flowering daffodils will have completed their growth enough that they can grow in light shade. So that gives you an idea. What happens to the typical tulip that you plant here after it comes into flower? Well, that's another approach. Maybe if you plant enough tulips, you'll draw them away from the other things. But if the deer didn't eat them, what would happen? Okay, today the tulip comes up. It's in flower. Isn't that beautiful? Tomorrow's summer, and it lasts about 3 days. And then also, it only lasts about 1 or 2 years before it's pooped out. Okay, plant species tulips. They come up early, like the other early flowers, complete their growth, etc., and can grow in that shade. And, you know, this is a 10-year-old clump. It's located behind a stone wall. The stone wall faced south, so when summer came, that got the full heat. But they were mature before that. The other thing, and I shouldn't really take all this time, but basically the reason that the hybrid tulips don't do well, where were they bred? Holland. Holland. What's spring like in Holland? Long and cool. What's spring like here? Short, and it gets hot before it's over. Warm soil causes tulip bulbs and most of the other bulbs to divide or multiply, whichever way you want to look at it. So you soon get a clump of little tiny bulbs that are too small to flower. Cold soil, when these are growing and doing their thing because it's early, so they last longer. Bulbs in the fall, autumn crocus, colchicum, available in actually 3 shades in effect, white and this color and then a darker one. Flower, the foliage comes up in the spring, dies down, and flowers come up in the fall.
Where does
Fritillaria
fit in with these?
Fritillarias, they are spring mostly, and there are some early ones there that would fit that bill, particularly the one they call guinea hen flower, the speckled, yeah. So some of those would work. Native plants, trillium for one. Bloodroot. Back was loose on the camera when I took that one, so you got a little light coming in there. Dogtooth violet. This is an oriental one, which is a little bit more fancy and elaborate than the native ones, but there are native dogtooth violets, of course, that will, or erythroniums. And you see that little buttercup sticking his head out from under there. We'll show you that again later. Jack in the pulpit. Hardy phlox that you see, you know, on the edge of the woods and growing along the roadside here works quite well in light shade. The Solomon seal, yeah, this is the green one to grow up about 4 feet tall. This is the variegated one, which is an oriental form, same flowers, but it'll only get about 2 feet tall. Both spread. Ferns that we have showed you. This is the unpainted version of the Japanese fern. You have the same texture as this Japanese fern here, except that it's green. It doesn't have the color in it. And here are the croziers that you can eat like asparagus on the cinnamon fern. And here's what we were talking about with the fertile fronds. So you can just clip those out. We inherited at the New York Botanical Garden the best or the biggest collection of hardy ferns in the Northeast from this fellow. He was a photomicroscopist with Bell Labs, photographing some of the early circuits like the transistors and this sort of thing under microscopes, and he discovered those spores on the bottom, and this led him to ferns, and he had the best collection or biggest collection of ferns in the Northeast, and he wrote the book, actually several editions of the book that became the Bible for ferns, and we inherited it. We moved him in July without losses. He was going to have to go into an adult home, he and his wife, and that's why we got it at that point. How do you keep those ferns growing in a climate such as this? Well, this is Dallas Botanical Garden. What you can't see is there's a little ravine below this, down in the middle, and that's where the ferns are. And what you see is a misting system. I don't recall whether theirs is on a humidistat or whether it's on a time clock. But in other words, mist comes on regularly and keeps the humidity up down in there. We actually had that with our collection in the New York Botanic Garden as well, because you needed it in the summer. There are some grasses that grow in shade. This is Hakonokloa, Japanese grass, variegated. There's a green form, and it will grow in fairly dense shade. It doesn't make any difference which direction you turn it, it's always going to grow the same way. In other words, it doesn't grow like towards light like most grasses or plants do. If you turn this around, it will grow in the other direction. It always grows in one direction. I don't know why. It's perverse, I guess. One of the things that tends to happen around universities is that some professor will have a line of research, and he will develop, say if he's a botanist or whatever, he'll develop a collection that goes with that he's done his research on. He retires or dies. Nobody else has the interest, and the thing just dies, you see. The whole collection goes. The New York Botanic Garden has the largest herbarium, collection of dried specimens, in the Western world, and second or third largest in the United States, close to 6 million specimens. And when I left the Botanic Garden 9 years ago, we were getting about 5 a year from universities where this had happened with the dried specimens. And the universities didn't want to devote space to them anymore. Nobody was doing research. So rather than those, some of them unique, the only collection of that kind of plant existing, we were accepting them. But this was a professor at the University of Connecticut who bred rhododendrons. And he was lucky. He took one of each thing home with him. And after he retired, this then remained. What he was doing was crossing that rather short, compact one in the foreground with others to create smaller rhododendrons that were more of an appropriate size for home properties. Because the average lot today around the city, even in the suburbs, is about 1/4 of an acre. And you don't need things that are going to get 10 feet tall. Westbury Gardens, 10th of May, give or take 5 days or so. This is the Primrose Path. So we used to take people on tours down the Primrose Path. Rustic arbor overhead, flowering dogwoods flowering up above it, providing shade. On either side of the walk, primroses swimming in a sea of blue forget-me-nots, backed on either side by pink and white azaleas. Now, how more romantic can you get than that? That's actually my favorite spot at the garden. Now she's talking. Here's that Brunneri I showed you. Little forget-me-not type thing. And you really can't see it, but just behind it is one of the astilbes that you weren't far enough along to bring this morning, with its fern-like foliage, and then it has the flowering spikes that come up, and this is one that has bronze foliage when it comes up. And here is peach blossom, probably my favorite, one of the bigger, sturdier of the astilbes, and they grow where hosses will grow. They provide that flowering that you see here, etc., so that they're a good companion plant. This is a garden in England, and Kifsgate, and this is a little shady path off to the side, and it was so densely shady that you see even these things tried to go out in the path to get more light. But you see how heavily they're flowering. So they work quite well. The hardy begonia. Many people in this area have it. It dies back to the ground, but comes up every year. It has little bulbs in the leaf axils that drop to the ground in the fall, and they come up all over the place. And there's a white-flowered form of it. Cimicifugia, snakeroot. This goes clear to the end of the season when it comes up above the other things in the shady border and flowers such as you see it there. Some of these new ones have bronze foliage. This is Bergenia. Sun or shade. Here I like it with a little bit of shade. Evergreen foliage. The foliage turns a reddish bronze in the fall and through the winter, and then in the spring this is what you get. Some people say it looks like cabbage. Not when it's in flower though. Bleeding heart. You've seen that. Here's your pulmonaria. And here it is beginning to flower. The garden outside Washington. The Helleborus, Lenten rose, Christmas rose. If you have a Wayside Gardens catalog, you've seen the picture on the front of it with all these luscious new colors that look like they're good enough to eat. Don't, because they're poison. But anyway, they've done hybridizing now that have brought scrumptious new colors available if you can get them. Retail, they cost about 30 bucks a piece. And they aren't really readily available enough to be able to buy them wholesale. The columbines. This is the native columbine. And it's happiest with light shade. This is that little buttercup that we showed you before, a little ranunculus. Once it gets started, produces a carpet in a very short time. And you get these yellow flowers. And some people don't like it because, you know, you go away on vacation when it's coming into flower like this, you come back, can't find it. In other words, it doesn't last very long. But in the early spring, you plant this among your hostas, for example, and it will be through by the time the hostas begin to come up and do their thing. Green and gold, Chrysogonum, another native of the Appalachians, a member of the same family as sunflowers, etc., but it grows in shade and flowers all season. Gets about 6 inches off the ground at most. Chrysogum, Chrysogonum.
It's on the list.
This is the Japanese anemones in Maine in October. We mentioned the taller ones. The flower or the foliage will come up about a foot and be, you know, a foot and a half or so across all summer, and then when fall begins to come, the flower spikes come up. They're good cut flowers too, by the way. Ground cover, this is the hardy myrtle that you're all familiar with. This is the epimedium that we showed you there. This one we haven't talked about. This is the hardy plumbago. Has a rather deep blue flower. It makes a carpet about 8 to 10 inches or so tall and flowers late in the season with this blue flower, and then before the freezing weather comes, that foliage takes on a sort of a burgundy color tint and does beautifully in the shade.
What's the name of that?
The simplest thing is to call it hardy plumbago. They changed the name from plumbago some years ago, the botanical name, to ceratostigma.
Yeah, a mouthful.
So think hardy plumbago. These botanists are always changing these things. This is what your tiarella will look like, your foam flower, when you really get it started. That's spectacular. Not many things, as we mentioned a while ago, to grow under maples, under beeches, where you got all these roots to contend with and usually very dense shade. Old Westbury Gardens, there is this particular strain of ivy. And I hope to get through to somebody to make this available to the public. Unlike most ivies that get dense and kind of, you know, mass of foliage and sort of untidy and all this sort of thing, this one just grows as a little carpet about 6 inches tall and makes it just a beautiful carpet underneath there, and grows.
Is it not as fast growing?
It grows more slowly, yeah. But it's the sort of thing you see you can tuck in between the roots, etc., and it makes just a lovely carpet.
What kind is it?
It's an English ivy, but it's not named and has never been released to the public. It's a unique one, probably planted by a bird. because most of the beech trees didn't have anything growing under them. And here you begin to put it together. This is the entrance to the Japanese garden, Missouri Botanical Garden, and you have Francis Williams hosta, the variegated one, peering out, and that's got big leaves. You have a tinier one on the sidewalk, that's Lancifolia, which has very narrow lance-shaped leaves, as his name would imply, with one of the fern-leafed or divided-leafed Japanese maples. It shows how you can begin to put these things together to create interesting combinations of them. Cary Arboretum, north of New York City, has been a part of the New York Botanical Garden, 2,000-acre site. Hosta Francis Williams, the variegated one, Sibboldiana elegans behind, from which the first one came. Japanese painted ferns in the foreground, and the tall plants behind are the tall bleeding heart. Through blooming, but the foliage is still there. This is Paul Aden. He is the hosta breeder on Long Island. Bit of a character, and the reason you see so much variegation is that that's what he breeds for. And he's done quite well. He's listed in this English book as one of the leading hosta breeders as such. So this is not really, a planting for enjoyment as much as it is his trial nursery. He used to call me a couple of times a year to come in and give him my opinion on the new ones. And I got to the point where I said, Paul, yeah, we'll do it as long as you got some of those onion rolls from the bakery down the street. And we would sit in the kitchen and go over them. And he would call us. This is important on hostas. He would call us then afterwards at the New York Botanical Garden, or when I was at Old Westbury Gardens, a few days later, and say, well, I've made my decisions and so forth. Would you like to have 4,000 divisions of hosta? Because he was getting rid of the surplus, you see. And we would say yes. And he'd say, well, you just have to write this thing out for tax purposes. And we would go down, and this is in the middle of July. And there would be a pile out in the sun, in the pathway, of hostas pulled bare root and laying bare root in the sun, 3-4 feet tall. You all live. Can't. They're hard to kill. And there are some grasses that will work well. We mentioned the Honocloa. Actually, in pretty light shade, you can grow the porcupine grass, the one with the stripes that you see in the background. Even the variegated yuccas and some of those things will work in light shade, but not in dense shade. This is what we're talking about when we talk about dappled shade, by the way. You see, sun just coming through here and there. What I like to do, where you are concentrating on hostas, is you plant basically a solid color. Now this might be a blue or it might be a green as such. Then here and there you group variegated or golden-leaved ones, etc. In his nursery setting there, I mean, that's overkill. Everything is variegated. But if you really want to set off a planting, use a solid color and then just highlight with these variegated forms, etc. And it's almost, even if you don't have dappled shades such as this, it's almost as if someone was up above with a spotlight on those plants. And just a few pictures to show you the variations in them. That's Sibboldiana elegans, the blue one. The gold one is one of Paul Aden's, which is Zounds. This is Lancifolia. This is one that makes up real quickly. Here's Zounds again. This one is Patriot. Or no, this is White Brim, rather. One of the variegated ones, also Paul Aden's. This is Blue Boy. More compact than some of them. This is Crosser Regal, which is a small plant, looks as if it's pretty much vase-shaped. But I saw one in Wichita, Kansas, a botanical garden last fall, about 4 feet across, and when you get it there, it's cascades down to the ground. Just a planting in a park in Columbus, Ohio. One of the few areas in public parks where they really have planted them in mass, such as you see here. And the New York Botanical Garden, our shade garden, where they're all put together. You can't see it too well here. The stilbe in the foreground is finished flowering. The peach blossom in the background is still flowering. In the middle, if you look, you see some white flowers. That's that Francis Williams hosta. Over to the right is Ligularia, the rocket, a spiky yellow flower that also grows in shade, and the other stuff around there, primarily ground cover. Right around the trunk of the tree is that hardy plumbago. Now, if you got a lot of money, you can do things like this. This is a garden called Innisfree, and this will be the last slide. It is at Millbrook, north of New York City, about 90 miles. And this guy was a sculptor. And then he married the heiress to the Mesabi Iron Range fortune. And he didn't really have to do this sculpturing for a living anymore. So he spent the rest of his life going through the woods up there in the Berkshire Mountains and so forth, finding interesting rocks. Had pretty masses of lichens and moss and so forth on them. And he built an entire garden of these. Took him his entire lifetime. And then tucked little ferns in here and there, and little vines, and the golden moneywort that Susan planted around the square last year in those gardens. It was growing in and around the rocks. And it was a beautiful place. Have any of you visited England and visited Wisley? Wisley is the garden of the Royal Botanical Society. And their headquarters was an old house, a half-timbered Tudor-style house, you know, that was magnificent. Well, they recreated that for this garden. And I really can't show it to you, because when they died, they did leave the place to a trust that maintained this garden of rocks, but they didn't leave enough money to maintain the house. And instead of going out and raising money, they took the other approach, was with dynamite. One of the saddest things, because you never saw a better combination. In other words, that house fit that garden, and over the hill was this beautiful little blue lake surrounded in the fall by sugar maples with all their color, etc. It was the most delightful scene, and I haven't been back since they blew the house up. So anyway, this gives you hopefully a bit of an idea of what you can do with shade, and shade doesn't need to be dull. I mean, you know, there's such a great variety of things that you can plant there that will create an interesting garden. And again, as I said at the beginning, what is more pleasant than to spend a summer afternoon in the shade? One of these days I hope to do it. I thank you.